Before I call the Health Secretary to make a statement, I want to repeat the point I made earlier. It is entirely unacceptable the government did not make today's statement announcement to the House first. It was disrespectful to the House and to our constituents. The government clearly planned that the media would be told information today, not far from this chamber, and that this House would have to wait until tomorrow. I want to say very clearly to the government that this is not how this House should be treated. The government's own ministerial code says when Parliament is in session, the most important announcements of government policy should be made in the first instance in Parliament. The Prime Minister polices the ministerial code. He wrote the foreword to it. He must now lead from the top and follow the guidance in it. This House can be assured that I'll be pursuing this matter with him. I do not find it acceptable at all that members of all this House are elected to come here to serve the constituents, not to serve them via Sky or BBC. The question should be made here. The Prime Minister should be here. I'm sorry if his dinner would have been affected, because I was told that he was in Brussels. I think the nearest Brussels tonight was the Sprouts and the dinner that was being served. But I say now, Prime Minister, you are on my watch, and I want you to treat this House correctly. I now call the unfortunate person who's had to pick up the pieces, the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, to make the statement. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, this past 6 months, we've all been involved in a race between the vaccine and the virus. Our vaccination programme has been delivered at incredible pace. We've delivered 71 million doses into 41 million arms. Over 93% of people aged 40 and over have now received at least one dose of the vaccine. And because of this pace, we are able to open up vaccinations to those aged 23 and 24 tomorrow. It's this protection that's allowed us to take the first 3 steps of our roadmap, meaning right now we have one of the most open economies and societies in Europe. We've been able to remove the most burdensome of the restrictions and restore so many of the freedoms that we hold dear. At every stage, we've looked at the data set against the 4 tests the Prime Minister set out to this House in February. The 4th of those tests is that our assessment of the risks is not fundamentally changed by new variants of concern. The Delta variant now accounts for over 90% of cases across the country. We know the Delta variant spreads more easily, and there's evidence that the risk of hospitalization is higher than for the previously dominant Alpha variant. Mr. Speaker, case numbers are rising, up 64% on last week in England, but the whole purpose of vaccination is to break the link between cases and hospitalizations and deaths. That link is clearly weaker than it once was. However, over the last week, we've seen hospitalizations start to rise, up by 50%. Thankfully, the number of deaths has not risen and remains very low. Sadly, before the vaccine, we saw a rise in hospitalizations inevitably led to a rise in deaths a couple of weeks later. The vaccine is changing that, but it's simply too early to know how effectively the link to deaths has been broken. We do know that after a single dose of the vaccine, the effectiveness is lower against this new Delta variant at around 33% reduction in symptomatic disease. However, the good news, confirmed with new data published today, is that 2 doses of the vaccine are just as effective against hospital admission with the Delta variant compared to the Alpha variant. In fact, once you've had 2 doses, the vaccines may be even slightly more effective against hospitalization if you've caught the new Delta variant. This gives me confidence that while the protection comes more from the second dose and so takes longer to reach, the protection we will get after that second jab is highly effective and, if anything, slightly better against the Delta variant. So, for the purpose of the restrictions, While it will take us a little longer to build the full protection we need through the vaccine, all the science is telling us that we will get there. And of course, all this says it's so important that everyone gets both doses when the call comes. Even today, I've had messages from people who've had their jab, and I'm so grateful to each and every person for making our country safer. At every stage of the roadmap, we've taken the time to check it's safe to take the next step. Our task is to make sure the vaccine can get ahead in the race between the vaccine and the virus. Mr. Speaker, I know so many people have been working so hard, making sacrifices, being cautious and careful, and doing their bit to help this country down the roadmap. I know that people have been planning and arranging important moments and that businesses have been gearing up to reopen. So it is with a heavy heart and faced with this reality, we've made the difficult decision not to move ahead with step 4 next week. Instead, we'll pause for up to 4 weeks until the 19th of July with a review of the data after 2 weeks. During this crucial time, we'll be drawing on everything we know works when fighting this virus, and we'll use the extra time to deliver the extra protection we need. Despite the incredible uptake we've seen in this country, there are still people we need to protect. 1.3 million people who are over 50 and 4.5 million over 40s have had a first jab but not yet a second. The pause will save thousands of lives by allowing us to get the majority of these second jabs done before restrictions are eased further. We're today reducing the time from first to second jab for all people aged 40 and over from 12 weeks to 8 weeks to accelerate the program. If, like me, you're in your 40s and you have a jab booked 12 weeks after your first, the NHS will be in touch to bring it forward, or you can rebook on the National Booking Service. Our aim is that around 2/3 of all adults will have had both doses by the 19th of July. And I can tell the House that we've been able to deliver the vaccine program faster than planned. So we can bring forward the moment when we will have offered every adult a first dose of the vaccine to the 19th of July too. In this race between the vaccine and the virus, we're giving the vaccine all the support we can. Mr. Speaker, we've always said that we'd ease restrictions as soon as we're able safely to do so. And even though we can't take step 4 on Monday, I'm pleased that we are able carefully to ease restrictions in some areas. We're removing the 30-person gathering limit for weddings, receptions, and commemorative events, subject, of course, to social distancing guidelines. And I'm very grateful to the work of the Weddings Task Force on this relaxation. We'll be running another phase of our pilots for large events at higher capacities, including some at full capacity, like the Wimbledon finals. We're easing rules in care homes, including removing the requirement for residents to isolate for 14 days after visits out, and we're allowing out-of-school settings to organise residential visits in bubbles of up to 30 children, in line with the current position for schools. And I thank my right honourable friend, the member for Trafford, for his work in this area. Even though we haven't been able to take the full step as we wanted, I know that these cautious changes will mean a lot to many people and move us a little bit closer to normal life. Mr. Speaker, as we do this, we'll keep giving people the support they need. We're extending our asymptomatic testing offer until the end of July. We've put in place one of the most extensive financial support packages in the world, and we'll continue to deliver enhanced support for the worst affected areas. We've seen how this approach can work, for example, in Bolton. Cases in Bolton have fallen by almost a third over the past 3 weeks. And even as hospitalizations have risen across the Northwest, in Bolton, they've fallen by more than half. Last week, we introduced enhanced support in Greater Manchester and Lancashire, and I now can tell the House we're extending these extra measures, surge testing, cautious guidance, and extra resources for vaccination to Birmingham, Blackpool, Cheshire, including Warrington, and the Liverpool City region. We know from experience that this approach can work, but we need everyone to play their part. So I'd urge everyone in these areas to get tested, to come forward for the support that's on offer, and when you get the call, get the jab, and help keep us on the road to recovery. Finally, Mr. Speaker, none of this would be possible without our vaccine programme, Without the vaccine, faced with these rising cases and hospitalizations, the clinical recommendation would have been to go back towards lockdown. The Vaccines Task Force is critical to this work to deliver supplies, work on booster jabs, and ensure we're protected for the future. Dame Kate Bingham did a formidable job in melding the best possible team, and I'd like to congratulate her and everyone else who was recognised in Her Majesty's birthday honours this weekend. I'm delighted to be able to tell the House that Sir Richard Sykes, one of Britain's most acknowledged biochemists and industry leaders, has agreed to take up the position of chair of the VTF. Sir Richard brings to bear experience from leadership positions in both the public and the private sector, and I'm delighted to have him on board to lead the team in the next stage of this mission. Mr. Speaker, this race between the vaccines and the virus, it isn't over yet. These difficult restrictions challenge our lives in so many ways, but they play a vital role in holding the virus back, protecting people while we get these jabs done. So let us all play our part to keep us safe from this dreadful disease, and I commend this statement to the House.
Before I call Jonathan Ashworth, who's 5 minutes, I want to remind the public that this statement is being interpreted by the British Sign Language interpreter. I now call the Shadow Secretary of State, Jonathan Ashworth.
Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for advanced sight of his statement and congratulate Sir Richard Sykes on his new role and thank Dame Kate Bingham. Tonight's announcement was both predictable and sadly predicted. And many of our constituents and local businesses will be deeply disappointed. Our constituents did what was asked of them. They queued up for vaccination. We praised them in this House. The Secretary of State shed tears on the news and boasted cry freedom on the pages of The Spectator. And yet now we're in the grip of a Delta wave spreading with speed, and our constituents face further restrictions. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's complacency allowed this variant to reach our shores. On March 25th, there were warnings of a new variant in India. It's reported that ministers first learnt the Delta variant was in the UK on the 1st of April. The government red-listed Pakistan and Bangladesh on April 9th, but didn't red-list India until April the 23rd, by which point 20,000 people had arrived from India. Mr. Speaker, our borders were secure as a sieve, and all because the Prime Minister wanted a photo call with Prime Minister Modi. And it's astonishing that these ministers promised to take control of our borders and conspicuously failed to control our borders at the very moment it mattered most. And not only did this Prime Minister open the back door to this variant, he failed to take measures to suppress it when he could. It's been growing in prevalence amongst school-aged children, yet mandatory mask wearing has been abandoned in secondary schools, and the Secretary of State has never explained why, despite being repeatedly asked. And we know that isolation is key to breaking transmission. And yet, 16 months on, people are still not paid adequate financial recompense to isolate themselves. When asked at the Select Committee last week, he claimed people would game the system. The only ones who game the system are the mates of ministers, Tory donors, spivs and speculators who made a fortune supplying Duff PPE. He seeks support for extending restrictions by pointing to plans to go further on vaccination. Well, we will support extending restrictions in the lobbies. But even after extending the doses that he's outlined, there will still be large proportions of the population left unprotected, having one dose or none, exposed to a variant which, if left unchecked, could accelerate and double every week, putting us on track for tens of thousands of infections per day by the end of this period. That will mean more hospitalizations. It will mean more long COVID. It will mean more disruption to schools and more opportunities for variants to emerge. So will the Prime Minister lift restrictions in those circumstances, as he appeared to promise tonight, or will infection rates and hospitalisations have to fall before he does so? Vaccination will get us through this in the end. So what then is his plan to bring down infections and extend vaccination rates in hotspot areas? We've learned that in Leicester, surge vaccination has been abandoned. In parts of the northwest, in Chorley, Mr. Speaker, in Tameside, in Salford, in Wigan, these are vaccination hotspot areas. The dose numbers have gone down. Has vaccination surging been abandoned in these hotspot areas? And finally, we are likely to see more infections in the coming days. We are likely to see more contacts of infected cases in the coming days. Will he finally give those people isolation support so they can isolate and quarantine themselves from the rest of society? The Chief Medical Officer tonight said we would be lifting restrictions if it was not for this Delta variant. The Prime Minister should have moved at lightning speed to prevent the Delta variant reaching our shores. Yeah. Instead, he dithered, and tonight he is responsible for this delay.
Well, I think in that response, Mr. Speaker, we saw a lifting of the veil of the opposition's position, because the right honourable gentleman knows that he has supported the government's position for a very large part of this crisis. And we'll be grateful for the support in the lobbies, quite rightly, because the Labour Party have clearly accepted the logic of the position. But the answer that he just gave and the questions he just raised gave a logic towards a position of never escaping from restrictions. But I want us to escape from restrictions, and the vaccine is the way for us to escape from restrictions. Now, the truth is, and it isn't the easy thing to say, but it is the correct and the right thing to say, is that in this country and around the world, COVID-19 will be with us, and we will have to learn to live with it in the same way as we learn to live with other deadly diseases like flu. And so the vaccine will help us to get to a state in which in this country we can manage this and live our normal lives. But the logic that the right honourable gentleman set out was one in which we would never escape. And it was a logic that was based on a flawed thinking about how things actually work in practice, because his other argument was this is all due to the government not taking decisions on India based on information that we did not have at the time. His argument is he's now seen in the published data that there was a problem in India. Too right, and as soon as we saw the data, we acted on it. But his whole case, which he set up, was that on April the 2nd, we should have acted. But on April the 2nd, neither the B1617 original Indian variant strain, nor the B1617.2, now the Delta strain, had yet been designated as a VUI or a VOC. So Captain Hindsight over there, arguing never escape from reality, and base your logic and base your evidence on things that haven't been recorded yet. That is no way to run a pandemic. Instead, we will put the interests of the British public first. We will take a cautious and irreversible approach. We will take difficult decisions if they're necessary, but we will get this country back onto the road to recovery.
Let's come to the chair of the Select Committee. Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by saying I totally agree with your disappointment that in a parliamentary democracy, Parliament heard about this news after the media. And much as I respect my right honourable friend, it should be the Prime Minister who is here this evening. I happen to support these measures and the caution the government is showing. But could I suggest to my right honourable friend that one of the reasons for the disappointment many people feel is the use of words like irreversible. Tonight, Sir Patrick Vallance said that we will be living with COVID for the rest of our lives. If there is a vaccine-busting variant that threatens another 100,000 lives, these measures will not be irreversible. And we have a duty to be completely honest with people about the bumpiness of the road ahead. So could I urge the Health Secretary to be as cautious with the language we use as he rightly is with NHS bed capacity?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the goal is that the steps in this roadmap are irreversible. That is the goal. And I'm sure it's a goal that my right honourable friend agrees with. Of course, I think we've demonstrated repeatedly during this crisis our willingness to take difficult decisions if they are necessary and if they're needed by the data. But I think it's also important to try to take steps when we can have a good degree of confidence that we will then be able to deliver that irreversible route, as opposed to moving faster than that, which might lead to a reversal. I hope that that explanation is one that my right honourable friend and indeed the House can concur with in terms of what we mean when we say that we seek an irreversible approach to this roadmap.
Let's go to SNP spokesperson, Dr. Philippa Whitford. Philippa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. While hospitalisations and ICU admissions are thankfully not increasing as fast as COVID cases, they are both rising significantly, so this delay was inevitable. According to Public Health England, the Delta variant appears to be about 50% more infectious and reduces the protection against infection from one vaccine dose to just 33%. As a single dose is therefore less effective, by what date does he expect all adults to be fully vaccinated with both doses? And would that not be a more appropriate time for the removal of all restrictions, rather than setting another arbitrary date when younger adults will not be fully protected? So how did we end up here? Having ignored the Scottish Government policy of all arrivals undergoing hotel quarantine, the Secretary of State then delayed adding India to the UK's red list at the same time as Pakistan and Bangladesh. He previously claimed it was because of greater positivity rates among travellers from Bangladesh and Pakistan, but this is not borne out by the published data. Between the 25th of March and the 7th of April, the test positivity of arrivals from India was 5.1%. Lower than Pakistan at 6.2%, but significantly higher than Bangladesh at 3.7%. Was the delay not just because the Prime Minister was still clinging to his plan for a trade visit to India? The whole point of border quarantine is to protect the UK from variants that might be more infectious or show resistance to vaccine-induced immunity. So having allowed the Delta variant to enter and become the dominant strain in the UK, does he not recognise that the government's border strategy has failed?
Well, I thought that the right honourable gentleman on the front bench opposite was Captain Hindsight, but seriously, this argument is completely divorced from reality. The data that she has just recommended to the House, Mr. Speaker, is data about what happened between the 25th of March and the 7th of April. And she complains about a decision the government made on the 2nd of April, because we didn't know of the data up to the 7th of April. So she brings to this House information from after a decision was taken and asks why it wasn't taken into account for that decision. And the answer is because it hadn't happened yet.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Virtually everybody in the most vulnerable category, which made up 95% of hospitalizations and deaths, are protected by both jabs. The vaccines work against all variants thus far, and the latest ONS data estimates that 8 in 10 of us have antibodies. So can my right honourable friend tell the House precisely how much better these metrics need to be in order for full freedom to be restored?
Our goal is that by the 19th of July, 2/3 of adults, around 2/3, will be double vaccinated. And the data published today shows that the protection from transmission of this disease from a single jab is quite a lot lower for the Delta variant, but the protection from hospitalization from both jabs is that bit higher. And that means that we do have to take a bit more time to get the protection from the double dose, whereas previously the single dose got a very significant proportion of the protection. But it does mean that once we get there, we have confidence in the effectiveness of the jab at keeping this virus at bay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Professor Chris Whitty's slide earlier this evening was very, very clear. We were on track to ease all restrictions next week until the Delta variant hit our shores and took off in the UK. So apart from the late decision to red list India, could the Secretary of State explain why it was on the 19th of April he told this House that the Delta variant was a variant of concern and there would be surge testing, yet it was not officially designated a variant of concern until the 6th of May. This is important because that is what unlocked the surge testing. So why was there a delay of 17 days? What impact does he think this delay has had on the spread and therefore on today's announcement?
I took action to tackle this variant before it was designated even as a variant under investigation, because I was worried about what was happening in India. So in a way, the Honourable Lady makes my point for me. On the Delta variant, we acted before it was recommended as a variant of concern by the scientific process. In fact, I have kicked off a review of that process because I think it is the process and the scientific advice that should advise me that are variants of concern. But having looked and seen the data in India, we took action even before it was recommended.
Let's go to Andrew Griffith. Andrew.
Tremendous effort by the Secretary of State and his colleagues in delivering 71 million doses have clearly made a difference, and it's why we're not going backwards today. I've previously raised the cause of the wedding industry in Arundel and South Downs. So will he accept my thanks for saving summer for this vital sector? But would he kindly support the Culture Secretary to ensure a successful summer of motorsport?
Yes, I work very closely with the Culture Secretary on making sure that these events pilots can go ahead. We're working very closely with F1. I'm delighted that we'll be able to see the Wimbledon finals go ahead on a pilot basis with 100% capacity. It's fantastic to see the crowds at Wembley. We are making progress, and these freedoms have returned. We aren't yet able to make the full step 4, but we're making the progress that we can.
Jim Shannon.
I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. We can all understand the difficulties that have been presented. Those who are willing to get married, who have put off their weddings, who have lost deposits, those who have been holding on to hope against hope that their special day will come. Does the Secretary of State not agree that the importance of a wedding celebration is equal at least to the importance of a football match or a summit, and that if there is to be a delay, consideration must be given to those getting married in July and August? And will the Secretary of State task a working group of experts to outline the safest way to allow these family events to take place, and then that those decisions will be discussed and conveyed to the Northern Ireland Health Minister? Thank you.
Yes, the Weddings Task Force have worked very hard on ensuring that there are COVID-secure ways of progressing, including opening up weddings, removing that cap on numbers, doing this within social distancing, and I hope that that will allow lots of the thousands of weddings that are planned over the coming weeks to happen in a way that is consistent with social distancing. I'm very happy to talk to my my opposite number in Northern Ireland, Robin Swan. He does an exemplary job. I know that he looks at these things very, very carefully, and I've no doubt we can have a conversation about that.
Speaker, I'm very grateful. Before I ask the Secretary of State my question, I should just say, as a former government chief whip, it doesn't give me any great pleasure to say so, but I wholly associate myself with your remarks earlier. This statement should have been made to this House by the Prime Minister before it was made to the media, and I hope we don't see a recurrence of it, and I wish you well in your meeting with the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State, I know, has set out that it is not the government's policy to get to zero COVID. Indeed, that's not possible. Could he say whether it's the government's policy to maintain a low prevalence of this virus? And if it's not, can he confirm the Prime Minister's sentiments today that July the 19th is a terminus date? And can he rule out bringing back restrictions in the autumn and winter when we see a rise, an inevitable rise, in what is a respiratory virus?
Well, it isn't inevitable. I don't think it's inevitable. It may happen, but it isn't inevitable because we also have the planned booster program to strengthen further the vaccination response. But it is absolutely clear, based on all of the clinical advice that I've seen, that a goal of eradication of this virus is impossible. Indeed, there's one part of this country that tried it for a bit in the summer, and it found it to be impossible. And therefore, we must learn to live with this virus, and we must learn how we can live our normal lives with this virus. So I reflect the Prime Minister's words, which of course I concur with entirely, on the 19th of July. Our goal is to make sure that we get as much vaccination done between now and then, especially those second doses, to make sure that we can open up safely, even if there's a rise in cases, by protecting people from hospitalisation and especially from protecting people from dying of this awful disease.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a hammer blow to hospitality businesses, many of which are trading currently at a loss, to the nighttime economy, which has been preparing to reopen and now faces more uncertainty. And many of the financial support packages that you referred to, the furlough, the rent moratorium, the VAT and business rate support, are due to either end or reduce. And businesses are still racking up debts for which they need a solution. If businesses are going to stay closed, support has to continue for as long as the restrictions last. So what is the government going to do to give extra support to businesses, many of which are in real danger of collapse?
That's right.
Yes, of course, I understand the impact of this decision on the businesses that are affected, both those that were hoping to open but will stay required to be closed by law, like nightclubs, and also businesses who can open but will find it harder to trade than they would otherwise. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has put in one of the most extensive sets of financial support in the world. And of course, the more affected a business is, the more they're able to draw down on that support, things like furlough. Furlough continues until September, but of course, there needs to be a step towards the restoration of normal economic life. But nevertheless, we are determined to support businesses, and hence the degree of support that has been put in place, that was put in place at the budget, not just to cover the period of the roadmap based on the not before dates, but to run further than that in case there needed to be a delay of one of those not before dates, because the whole principle was that we take these steps based on data, not dates.
Sir Graham Blady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I confirm that many of those who are going to hospital now with COVID are actually staying in hospital for a far shorter period than was the case earlier in the pandemic? Will he break down those figures for us? And will he also publish figures showing the breakdown between those who present in hospital for other reasons, but subsequently test positive, and those presenting with COVID?
Yes, I'm very happy to seek to publish all of those data. I think the latter data, are published already. On the former data, the best estimate that I have is that the average length of stay for somebody in hospital due to COVID has fallen from on average 10 days to on average 8 days. So it has fallen to a degree, but not a huge degree. That's partly because of treatments, but it's also partly because some of the people in hospital have had at least one dose of the vaccine, which is highly likely to have reduced the severity of the disease. In the 10 most affected hospital trusts, on average, the number of people going to hospital who've had both doses is under 20%. A further approximately 20% people who've had one dose, the remainder, the majority, people who haven't been vaccinated at all.
Mark Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I firstly associate myself with your remarks about the government's behaviour and its complete contemptuousness complete contempt rather for this House on both sides of the chamber. Mr. Speaker, on current rates, I understand we're looking at something like 40,000 cases by the first week of July, according to his own department's data. What does this action, that's on trend, What does this actually say about the government's decision or the Prime Minister's decision not to put India onto the red list when it was clearly at twice the infection rate of Pakistan and Bangladesh? Wasn't that just simply a very expensive photo opportunity that's going to cost Warwick and Leamington businesses and across the country dear?
No, because any businessman or woman in Warrington or in Warwick or indeed in Leamington will understand that it is literally impossible to take decisions on data that hasn't yet occurred. The Honourable Lady for the Liberal Democrats had it right when she pointed out that we didn't know this data at the time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend will be well aware, people in Keighley and Ilkley have never come out of some form of restrictions. In fact, of July last year, we went into some of the toughest local restrictions. So going forward, will the Secretary of State confirm that will rule out using a regional approach so that communities like mine can come back out of this pandemic and recover as normal?
We have, in the last month or so, surged in testing and changed recommended advice, but we have not taken the approach of regional approach to the legal restrictions. And frankly, I think that has been a better way of doing things. I know it's gone. I know that that's what the people of Keighley would prefer, and they're very wise folk.
Can I first of all congratulate Tony Lloyd on his knighthood? Sir Tony Lloyd.
And thank you for your remarks, Mr. Speaker, both at the beginning of this session and to me personally. I'm grateful. Mr. Speaker, it's axiomatic that the higher the rate of infection, the higher the rate of transmission. And if in this battle between the virus and the vaccine, the virus wins with those high rates. And the only antidote to that is, as in Bolton, where we saw surge vaccination, Bolton is now second highest in the Greater Manchester boroughs and been overtaken, alas, by Salford. But that's why people across Greater Manchester don't understand why we don't have surge vaccination. Yes, it would be good for Greater Manchester. It would actually be good for the whole country. Can the Secretary of State explain?
I would love to surge vaccinate the whole country. The supply is the rate limiting factor. It has been from the start. And so to surge the whole country would be to go as fast as we can, which is what we're doing already. So yes, we can surge into relatively small areas. What we're doing in the areas that need extra support, which now constitute about 10% of England, is we're increasing the testing where we have got that the spare capacity, especially of the lateral flow kits. We're putting in place the guidance to be more cautious, and we're putting in place the extra support we can give to get the vaccines out, and especially into groups who are harder to reach. But we need to bring the whole country forward with the vaccination programme. That's why we're going as fast as we can. And I'm delighted that we're able to bring forward the date by which we'll have been able to offer all adults a dose from the end of July to the 19th of July as part of what we're able to announce today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has taken the wedding industry up to the top of the hill and told them they can open up without restrictions, but they've marched them down again to say only if you can socially distance. Many wedding venues don't have huge rooms, so it is going to be very difficult. And I'm very concerned that this wedding industry and the couples who want to get married are going to be incredibly disappointed by this announcement today. Is there no way that the Secretary of State can overrule that and allow, obviously with care, them to be able to go ahead with no restrictions so long as they're sensible, but without the fear of the social distancing?
Well, I, of course, understand why many in the wedding industry and many who are planning to get married in the next month would prefer to be able to do so without any of these rules at all. I don't want these rules either. But unfortunately, we have got a virus which is growing again, and we've got to take the extra time to allow the vaccines to come through. So therefore, the social distancing rules are staying in place right across the board, and carving them out for one very specific activity is something that we looked at, but a very, very difficult decision to take for all sorts of reasons, legal and practical, and in terms of fairness to everybody right across the board in different circumstances.
Let's go to Barbara Keeley. Barbara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to return to this question of surge vaccinations because case rates in Salford are higher than they have been since mid-January. They are 5 times higher than the national average, and they're doubling around every 7 days. We need to get vaccines into arms as quickly as possible, but this week we only have 3,500 doses of Pfizer, and that's falling to 2,200 doses next week. So despite promises from Secretary of State of enhanced support and some talk of surge vaccinations in hotspots like Salford, that lack of doses of the Pfizer vaccine is the major barrier to getting everyone in Salford jabbed. Will the Secretary of State remove that barrier? Will he make sure we get the supply of Pfizer and the flexibility to vaccinate all our over 18-year-olds?
Well, I'm afraid that my reply is the same as to her honourable friend, also from Greater Manchester earlier, which is that supply is the great rate limiting factor. She shakes her head, but that is a matter of fact that supply has throughout been the rate limiting factor. And so we will do everything we can to support a vaccination using the doses that we've got. As she well knows, the UK, thankfully, is right at the front of the global race to get vaccinated, and that's because we bought early in very large bulk. Of course, we work to make that supply as big as possible, as fast as possible, and we go as fast as we can, but we can't go faster than we can.
Sir Robert Neal. Robert.
Thank you for calling me, Mr. Speaker, and for what you have said tonight as well. As my right honourable friend not recognised that just a few weeks or a little longer in the Prime Minister's parlance, it makes the difference between survival or closure for some businesses? Will he recognise that therefore forcing businesses to remain closed for a further period without financial support being extended for the same equivalent period is unjust, unconscionable and unsupportable? Will he take that back to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, please?
Well, I happily will, but I would urge my my honourable friend to see the financial support that is in place and continues to be in place, most of it through to September, and was extended to that period in case we had to make an extension to the roadmap like this. And whilst I fully understand the impact on business, of course I do, I also can see the impact on saving lives, and the advice that this change will save thousands of lives because the protection of the vaccine, especially against dying of COVID, is very, very strong, but the vaccine coverage is not yet comprehensive, especially with those second doses. And so we need to get that done.
Thank you for calling me, Mr. Speaker. There are now huge differences in the vaccination rate between Britain's poorest wards and Britain's richest wards. In Heartlands ward in my constituency, we have sky-high infection rates, but rock-bottom vaccination rates. Yet the ward, as he knows, is home to Heartlands Hospital. Down the road, GPs told me this afternoon there is no Pfizer left in their fridges. There's no certainty about when it's going to arrive, and they don't know how much they're going to get when it does come. We know that when we open mobile units, there's a 5-hour queue. We know that pharmacies are successful, but in Birmingham tonight, there are at best vaccines for just 10% of the population of 18 to 29-year-olds. So over the next 34 days, how many Pfizer doses will arrive in Britain's second city? Because we can't unlock until we unblock this pipeline.
Well, I think before making an intervention like that, the right honourable gentleman should firstly thank the teams who have supplied so much vaccination to this country, acknowledge that we've gone faster than almost anywhere else in the world, and work with us, work with the mayor in the West Midlands, work across Birmingham to make sure that we get the testing done as well, and to make sure we get vaccination done wherever possible. The fact that the fridges ran out of Pfizer demonstrates we're getting through this as fast as we can. But supply is the rate limiting factor on vaccination. It always has been. And on that, the team have done a pretty amazing job, and I support them to go as fast as they possibly can over the weeks to come, and that's what we'll get done.
Mr. Speaker, across our country, alarming numbers of people not only forecast that this extension would happen, but increasingly believe that they're never going to see true freedom again, freedom from these restrictions, which he's promised us. What more can he say about the conditions under which we'll get to step 4 to reassure those people that this government will actually set them free, and indeed, in due course, set them free from all of the paraphernalia of the management of this pandemic?
Well, I want to get rid of all of the restrictions that have been put in place to manage this pandemic. And we will get there. And what I would say is that he will have noticed that the link that we have made and explicitly made is to the rate of vaccination, getting the vaccines done over these 4 weeks to come. Of course, it's my duty to recommend to the Prime Minister the actions that I think are necessary to keep people safe. As a Health Secretary, that is my duty. But I am also a parliamentarian who represents constituents who want these restrictions removed as soon as safely possible. That is our goal. It is a difficult balance. I think we've got the balance right, unfortunately, today. I say unfortunately because I wish it was easier. It is not, but we are able to make some progress, and I very much hope that we can make the full degree of progress that he wants to see in the not too distant future.
Graham. I want to ask about the Test and Trace app, because this relates to freedom as well. As I understand it, the government is intending to keep the legislation in place on Test and Trace all the way through until next March. At the moment, tens of thousands of people every day are pinged by the app. The app doesn't tell you when the infection might possibly have taken place. I know of schools where 4 whole classes were sent home because a single teacher had been pinged over the weekend. I've known of whole construction businesses where every single person has had to be sent home. If we keep on doing this, in particular in some parts of the country where there are high levels of infection, we are going to have large parts of the economy constantly being closed down. And the financial problems, I know there's some measures in place, but they're still very difficult, especially for middle-class families, actually, who may have the financial freedom but still find it very difficult to stay in work and be able to do their work when the rules are all changing. If we really want freedom, we're going to have to turn this blunderbuss into something rather more precise, aren't we?
Well, of course, the purpose of the app is to identify people who've been in close contact with somebody who has tested positive and let them know that, and therefore ask them to self-isolate. That is what it's there for. Now, he asked me to get more data so that we could be more targeted. He will know from last summer's debate that the restrictions on the amount of data that we can gather through that app are put in place by the companies rather than by us, so we can't be more targeted, and I'm very happy to arrange a briefing for him on the details of that. But the goal actually is to ensure in time, especially for those who've been vaccinated, that we follow through on the pilots we've done, under which people who are contacts, not the cases themselves, but there are pilots where the contact is able to go into a testing regime rather than having to isolate. There are pilots underway to check clinically that works, and I look forward to seeing the results of those pilots.
Lynn. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend advise us about the demographics of those he believes are likely to be hospitalised? Today, Public Health England said that both the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca virus can cope as well with the India variant as well as the Kent variant. The Pfizer vaccine is 94% effective against hospital admission after 1 dose, 96% after 2. AstraZeneca, 71% effective against hospitalisation with 1 dose and 92% after 2. Who would be hospitalised to the extent that the NHS would be swamped? And can he promise us that we will not have our country locked down because some individuals who could be immunised choose not to be?
Yes, thankfully the take-up rates are very high, and therefore it's only a very small proportion of people who have chosen not to come forward to get the jab when offered. But he has an important point, which is that the obligation of the state to get the country out of this falls more heavily on ensuring that vaccinations are offered than they are taken up. Our goal is to ensure take-up is as high as possible. But the commitment we can make, given that we're not going to go for mandatory vaccination across the board, the commitment we can make is to offer. And there is an important distinction between the two, as he draws out. On the makeup of the hospitalizations, the average age has fallen considerably since the vaccination program started. And as we then, that is probably in large part due to the fact, of course, that the older cohorts got vaccinated first. But it also does, on average, reduce the acuity of those in hospital, and therefore also helps to break the link between hospitalizations and deaths yet further. I hope that answers his first point.
Let's go to Stella Creasy. Stella.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware of the evidence that women who contract COVID in their pregnancies are twice as likely to experience a stillbirth or a premature birth. He will also know that the JCVI decided in May that it was not worth prioritising these patients for the vaccine because, and I quote, the low infection rates made the absolute risk to pregnant women very small. Given the data that has been presented today and the evidence of the high risk of infection rising across the country, will he now rethink that and ensure that all pregnant women, especially those in their third trimester and at any age, are also fast-tracked to have both doses of the vaccine so that we can ensure that we protect not just them, but also their unborn children from harm?
This is an issue that I've discussed with my clinical advisors because it's a very sensitive issue. I'm sure that she'd join me in urging all pregnant women to come forward and discuss vaccination with their clinician because that is important, and she sets out some of the reasons why. We have, of course, now opened up from tomorrow vaccination to all those aged 23 and over, and so soon vaccination will be available to every adult. And that means that these questions of prioritization will be for the past, other than the question of vaccination of children, which is separate in many ways and an important one that we'll address in the coming weeks. What I would say to anybody who is pregnant is as soon as you are eligible for a vaccine, please discuss it with your doctor, because for the vast majority of people who are pregnant, the right thing to do is to get the jab as soon as possible and get both jabs as soon as is practicable. And I think that's something on which she and I would agree.
Last week, the Health Secretary told me, and I quote, "Our goal is not a COVID-free world. The goal is to live with COVID." But I have to say, you could have fooled me and many of our constituents, Mr. Speaker. There is dismay out there tonight. The reopening of the wedding industry is not a meaningful reopening, and I think it's cruel the way some are being misled. The Prime Minister and my right honourable friend have been very clear today. July 19th is not a new, not before date. It is an end to all of this. So can the Health Secretary tell the country what his assessment is of risk and personal responsibility, and whether he feels we remotely as a country have that right at this time?
Well, I think that in a pandemic, the balance between risk and personal responsibility is different, because you can affect somebody else in a life-threatening manner even without knowing it. And as if we go to the philosophy of this, the first duty, in fact, the legitimate duty of the state for any liberal is to prevent harm of individuals to others. And unfortunately, in a pandemic, that's what you do if you have the disease, especially asymptomatically. You can be harming others without even knowing it. Now, once you have the offer of a vaccine to everybody, and once you have protected and mitigated the large part of that risk, then we do need to move back to a world based on personal responsibility. That is right. That is where we intend to go. And I think that we've made steps already in that direction in steps 1, 2, and 3. This country is freer than almost any other in Europe in terms of our economy, in terms of our society. That's partly because of the very rapid vaccination effort here. But I think that I hope my honourable friend can take from that the direction we intend to go.
Let's go to Yvette Cooper. Yvette?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're in this position because of the Delta variant, whose spread the government could have slowed by putting India on the red list earlier instead of waiting while the Prime Minister faffed around over his trade trip. By late March, Canada was warning of high levels of COVID cases arriving from India. By early April, similar warnings were coming out of Hong Kong. And by the 7th of April, hundreds of people were arriving here from India with COVID, and half of them had new variants. Yet even when the minister finally announced India on the red list, he inexplicably waited another 4 days while many more people with the Delta variant returned. So can he tell me, why is he still refusing to publish the analysis and advice provided on India by the Joint Biosecurity Centre that the Select Committee has asked for? Please, will he publish it now?
Well, we published the data for the number of imported cases of B1617 and other variants at the time the decision was taken. That data was the data including up to the 7th of April for when we took the decision, which was announced on the 19th of April. But it does take that time to see the sequencing because it operationally takes time. Since we've published that data, I've heard endless calls from the opposition benches, including from the Right Honourable Lady, that I should have acted on data that we couldn't see and hadn't been gathered. And that is only a way to make a point if you don't care about the truth of what actually happened.
Let's go to Caroline Noakes. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the evictions ban comes to an end and rate relief ends, what reassurance can my right honourable friend give businesses like Fit School in my constituency, who are still operating under restrictions, that this delay to full step 4 really is the last delay?
I understand entirely the point that my right honourable friend is making in terms of these restrictions and the impact on businesses, and in particular, the link to those in rent arrears is something I've been discussing with the Communities Secretary, and I'm very happy to meet with her and discuss how, in the short term, we can make sure that businesses like her, the one in her constituency that she mentions, get the support they need.
Let's go to Ali Tahir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State makes reference to Captain Hindsight as a cheap political point scoring to deflect the seriousness of the debate. May I suggest, Mr. Speaker, he refers to the cartoon character much suited to his own government as Danger Mouse. Mr. Speaker, can the Secretary of State explain why India was included on the travel red list a full 2 weeks after countries with much lower rates of infection? And this decision came immediately, almost immediately, after the planned visit by the Prime Minister to India was cancelled. Mr. Speaker, in my constituency of Birmingham Hall Green, many residents believe the decision to include Pakistan and Bangladesh on the red list countries was politically motivated. Can the Secretary of State indicate when will countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh and others be removed from the red list countries to amber to restore public confidence?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. He refers to political point scoring and then makes points that he knows are not supported by the facts. When the decision for the April the 2nd change to put Pakistan and Bangladesh on the red list, as I've said to this House before, test positivity of travellers returning from Pakistan was 4.6%, 3 times the 1.6% positivity of returning travellers from India. Those are the facts, the basis on which the decision was taken. I'm not quite sure. I think at the end of his question, he asked if we could now take these countries and put them off the red list onto the amber list. I do not support that approach because I think it's important to keep this country safe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will understand my dismay, given that he will recognise, as we've discussed between ourselves, that economic harm and the sustainability of businesses is a real concern of mine. And I do worry about the distress that this announcement's caused. But if we're taking one particular sector in the international travel business, the issue of cruises. The cruise industry now has been closed for international sailing for now more than 15 months. And there really does need to be clarity if we are going to save this sector, which supports 90,000 jobs and is worth £10 billion a year to the British economy. So could I ask him to really make clear to the Chief Medical Officer that the cruise industry really needs its own roadmap to be able to embark on international travel again?
Well, my honourable friend makes a strong and important point. I get the impact on business, of course I do, especially on international cruises. I'm glad we were able to work with the cruise industry to get some domestic cruise trips going again, admittedly in a small way, to essentially to pilot it. It is more difficult on an international front. I'm very happy to work with her and with my right hand friend, the Transport Secretary, on what more we can do.
Let's go to Caroline Lucas. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State feel any shame that the reason that we need to delay the easing of restrictions let the virus spread? That might be great news for Serco, whose profits are up today, but it's a disaster for everyone else. And does he recognise that to protect people at home, we also have to do much more to vaccinate people in poorer countries, both because it's a moral imperative, but also so that we reduce the chance of new variants being imported here? And will he therefore adopt a jab matching policy in which for every single dose administered in the UK from now on, we donate another dose to COVAX, as well as scaling up the UK's own vaccine production? Because the UK's pledge of 100 million doses includes only 5 million by the end of September, and that is too little, too late.
No, I don't agree with most of that. In particular, I think that the Right Honourable Lady and the whole House should welcome the announcement by the Prime Minister that we will be ensuring that when we have excess supplies, and I stress when we have excess supplies, we will donate 100 million doses around the world. I'm not going to do that before we have excess supplies because we want to make sure people are vaccinated here at home. She shakes her head, but my first duty is to protect people here in this country, whilst at the same time making sure people get access around the world, as we've done, for instance, with the Oxford AstraZeneca jab, where 500 million jabs have been done around the world. That's my priority. That is my order of priorities. I'm very, very clear about it. We will help the rest of the world to get vaccinated, but we also need to look out for and vaccinate the British population. And as for the first half of her statement, it was completely wrong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my constituents in Newcastle-under-Lyme have done everything that we've asked of them during this pandemic. They stayed at home, they protected the NHS, and then they went out and got vaccinated in huge numbers. And so any sense that these restrictions are to protect those who chose not to get vaccinated will be seen by them and by me as deeply unfair. So could the Secretary of State set out what assessment he or his scientific advisors have made as to what extent these restrictions are required to protect those who chose not to get protected?
This change is emphatically not for the purposes of protecting those who've chosen not to get vaccinated. It is emphatically to ensure that we have the time to offer the jab, both for second jabs for those who've had their first, and to get first jabs offered to all adults. If we go through the data on that, over 40s, 93% have currently had their first jab, but there's still 4.5 million who haven't yet had the second jab, and we can get through the majority of those over the next 4 weeks. And then, of course, we've been able to bring forward the date by which we'll have offered a first jab to everybody. And it is getting the ability of the people who want to come forward and get jabbed that is what we will achieve by the 19th of July to that degree. Now, I hope that we end up with uptake almost 100% by the end of this, and the uptake figures have been absolutely astonishing. So we'll keep offering and we'll keep encouraging people to come forward and keep trying to make the system and the vaccines as accessible as possible. But the thing that is in direct control of the government, subject to supply, of course, is offering the jab. That's the commitment that we've made by the 19th of July.
Okay. Secretary of State will know that the hospitality and tourism industry has probably been hit more than any other part of our economy throughout this period. One of the challenges at the moment, of course, is that the ongoing restrictions mean that hospitality and tourism businesses need more staff than normal in order to cater for fewer customers than normal. Is he aware that the biggest single issue raised with me by hospitality tourism industry bosses in the Lakes and the Dales is a lack of staff? It's a lack of staff largely caused by the government's new visa rules. I wonder if he'd agree to get his immigration minister friend to sit down with me and, more importantly, hospitality and tourism leaders from Cumbria and other rural parts and tourism parts of the country to discuss an emergency way of giving that vital boost to our hospitality and tourism industry just now.
I'm happy to arrange that for the right honourable gentleman. I almost thought he was going to say at the end of that, Mr. Speaker, that he was glad that now Britain controls its own borders.
Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm most grateful. Young people have made big sacrifices during this pandemic and have seen 2 years of their lives disrupted. Many students and school leavers will be leaving school and university between now and the 19th of July. So will he confirm that what he said in his statement, that removing the 30-person limit on commemorative events includes graduation ceremonies and school leaving parties in commercial venues? Because after all, school students in particular have been in bubbles with each other, being educated with each other for months now, and it would add insult to injury if they were to be denied an opportunity to say farewell to each other.
I will ensure that the precise Cabinet Office guidance reaches my right honourable friend's mobile phone as soon as possible. I am an hour and 5 minutes into this, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to get back to my right honourable friend on that one.
Peter Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of Health heard what you said at the beginning of this statement. But can I ask the Secretary of State, how do we get ourselves in this position? He's been very good at coming to this House and making statements on COVID. But on the biggest, most important day, the press has given an embargo statement at 3 o'clock. The Prime Minister has a big showy press conference at 6, and he can't be bothered to turn up until 8:30. This is a clear breach of the ministerial code. How did it happen? Who thought it was a good idea? And who actually broke the ministerial code?
Mr. Speaker, all I can say is I'm here now answering questions, and I'm happy to stay for as long as you need me.
Clifton Brown.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, that was an unexpected surprise. I'm sure it was to the Secretary of State as well, and I'm sure that he will be interested in the question I'm about to ask him, which is, ultimately, these decisions are a matter of judgment. Can he publish the data as to the risk to the health service and the risk to individuals of death, as opposed to the social harm and the harm to businesses, and therefore why the judgment has been made that it is?
The best thing that I can point my right honourable friend to is the slides that were presented by the Chief Medical Officer today. I will seek whether there's anything further that we can publish, but as a general rule, we publish all of the data on which these judgments are made. Central to them, central to the judgment today, is the fact that we are seeing a rise in hospitalizations, especially over the last week, and that is especially amongst those who are unvaccinated or have just had a single jab. And that isn't largely unvaccinated out of choice. It's unvaccinated because they have not yet had the opportunity because they're younger. Now, until about a week ago, hospitalizations were basically flat. And we thought it may be that the link had been completely broken between cases and hospitalizations, or it may be a lag. Sadly, they did then start to rise. For deaths, we have not yet seen that rise, which I'm very pleased about. Hopefully it will never rise, in which case the future is much easier. It may yet still be that there's an element of it that's a lag, and we'll be looking out for that very carefully over the couple of weeks ahead. But nevertheless, our goal is to get those vaccines done in the next the 5 weeks between now and the 19th of July in order to make sure that this country is safe. And I will commit to him to publish anything further that we can that underpin the decision. But I can honestly say to him that the most of it is already in the public domain.
Point of order, Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I completely agree with every single word of what you said at the beginning of this session, but I guess you knew that I would. I do want to ask, however, about the provisions for how we do our business from next week, because as you know, all of these things were timed to change at the same time as the national situation. That's now been changed. I presume that there will be a knock-on effect for how we do our parliamentary business in terms of parliamentary select committees, whether they're meeting hybrid or virtually, and how we conduct our business in the chamber and the division lobbies and all of that. Some of that I know is your responsibility solely, but some of it is the responsibility of the government and might need standing order changes. I just wonder whether you've had any notification from the government that they're intending to bring these forward, when we're going to be debating them, when we're going to be making sure that we get them right, whether there be proper debate, and whether is there going to be a business statement to tell us when all of that is going to happen.
Right. Yep. If it's the same one.
That point of order. I was struck listening to the Secretary of State when he talked about the need to get people vaccinated and the very important difference that makes to the level of risk. Mr. Speaker, in the House making a decision about how we conduct our affairs, would it be relevant to look at the proportion of members who have been single or double vaccinated? Because my judgment would be, but if the vast majority of us have been, then this level of social distancing is simply not necessary. And this House could get back to being what I know you want, Mr. Speaker, which is much more effective at holding the government to account.
Let me just say I have a lot of sympathy about getting this chamber absolutely back to normality. What I would say is it's not just about members having double doses. It's also the staff which have got a duty of care to. And that's why I asked quite a long time ago, let's see if we can't get our staff and staff of members inoculated more quickly than we are doing at the moment. But coming on to the other points, we have an important opposition day tomorrow, but let us see if the government brings forward proposals on Wednesday for this House to decide on its own procedures from Monday up to the summer recess. I do expect the Leader of the House to consult other parties in the House before they bring forward what proposals are expected. So I'm hoping and I am sure that those conversations will take place and take place quickly in order for the House to know where we're going. And my suggestion will be, I think because the date's so close to the summer recess, it will be easier to take it through for the sake of 3 days if this House agrees to what's being proposed. Right, let's now suspend the House for 3 minutes in order to allow the business to take place by cleaning up the House at the moment.